Hi everyone, I'm Paula and welcome to Sew Spark Studio. Today I'm going to be doing 3 traditional quilt blocks: the Dutchman's puzzle, duck tracks, and an 8-point star variation. And I'm going to be doing them in an assortment of blues. They're actually going to be incorporated into another baby quilt that I'm doing for one of my nephews. But they could be used in any quilt of any size that you happen to want to make. So I hope that you will join me, and let's get started. This quilt block is an 8-point star variation. To make this quilt block, you're going to need 3 colors of fabric. A light, a medium, and a dark is what I've chosen to use here today. And so I've got 2.5-inch strip of light and a 2 1/8 inch strip of medium, and then I have a 3-inch strip of each of the 3 colors to do this. Now I have more fabric than you'd need to do one block, because I'm going to be doing actually 4 blocks of this particular one, and it is going to be an 8-inch block for what I'm doing today. Now I'm also going to be using my triangle ruler and a square ruler as well. If you don't have the square one, any quilting ruler will work for this. And if you don't have a triangle ruler, on my website, sewsparkstudio.com, I do have this template, and these triangles are the size that you would need in order to make an 8-inch block. Now, you want to make sure when you print this that you print it 100%, not fit to size. This box should be a 1-inch square, otherwise the triangles won't necessarily make the blocks the right size for an 8-inch block. Starting with the 2.5-inch light strip, I'm going to be cutting 2.5-inch squares out of this. For one block you would need 4 squares. I'm making 4 blocks, so I'm going to need a total of 16 2.5-inch squares. And I have this folded in half, so I'm cutting 2 at a time. This is 2 strips of the 2 1/8 inch medium colored fabric. And so I'm using my triangle ruler, and this would be the smaller of the triangles on the template. This one has the top kind of squared off the point of the triangle because you don't actually need that. So that lines up with the edge of my fabric, and then I'm just making sure the line is straight here. And I'm cutting 4 triangles at a time. You need 8 triangles for each block, so I need a total of 32 of these. Now I knew ahead of time I wasn't going to have enough left here to get the full 32, so I have 28, and I'm actually going to get 30, and then I'm going to use scraps from one of the other cuts to get the other 2. So I'm not going to cut them right now. I'll cut them after I've finished cutting the other pieces for this block. This is the 2.5-inch strip of the light color, and I need 4 of the larger triangles out of this for each block, so a total of 16. And so again, this is the larger triangle here. And same thing, mine has the top kind of cut off a little bit, so I just line it up here. And I'm getting 2 triangles at a time right now. So that gave me 12 triangles. I can actually get 13 out of this. And then I'm going to need 3 more triangles. So I will need to cut another 2.5-inch strip for that. Either that, or I'm going to use some pieces left over from scrap. So now I have a 3-inch strip of the light and a 3-inch strip of the medium, and I'm putting them right sides together on top of each other. And I'm going to make triangle squares out of these. So I'm going to start by just cutting off the selvage here. And then I'm using my friction marking pen. These marks will steam off. And I'm going to draw 3-inch lines. And I need a total of 4 of these. I actually only need 1 for each quilt block. Do all of the ones I need right now. And then I'm also going to draw a diagonal line across each one of these. And this is going to be a cutting line and a guideline for stitching. And then I'm going to just cut the excess off here. And this extra fabric could be used to make those triangles that I didn't have enough fabric for earlier. And I'm just going to put a pin in each of these for now so that it doesn't shift. And I'm going to do the same thing. I have another strip of the light, right side up. And again, on top of each other. I'm going to flip this, it's easier to see the markings on the light fabric. Again, trim my selvage. I'm going to start the 9-point star by dealing with the triangle squares in the center here, and then I'll explain how the whole thing goes together. We drew this diagonal line on these 3-inch squares, and I'm going to sew on each side of the line 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters away from the line. So I have my 1/4 inch foot on my machine, and I'll use the edge of the foot as a guideline when I'm stitching these lines. Before I finish with the triangle squares, I'm going to keep working at the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew one of the small triangles to one of the large triangles on each side of the block. To sew these triangles together, I like to know where the center is. And so if you fold it in half and mark the fold, or you could put a pin there, and then do the same on the other side. And remember, my triangle is squared off at the top there, so I need to extend the point like this when I do my fold to get the halfway point. And then I'm going to match those points when I sew this together. Once you've sewn on each side of this line, you're going to cut these apart. And then what you end up with are 2 triangle squares. And I'm going to press these, and then I'll trim off the points on the sides of them there. I have my triangle squares here, so I'm going to press these first the way I sewed them. And then I'm going to press them towards the darker colored fabric. And then these ones will be trimmed to 2.5 inches so that these points are cut off on each side. So this is the way it looks when it's pressed correctly, with the lighter color blue pressed towards the light fabric and the darker blue, it's pressed towards that dark fabric. Then I have the small triangles that I sewed to the larger ones. And again, press it as it was sewn. And then I'm also going to press this towards the darker color. This is the 8-point star so far, and I haven't trimmed anything yet because I'm going to wait and trim everything at the same time. So the next step is to sew the other small triangle on the opposite side of the larger triangle. And again, I've centered each of the edges before stitching. More pressing. So again, this triangle, and press towards the darker color, the small triangle. And once this is trimmed, this will be a rectangle. Now I'm going to trim the rectangles and the squares so that they are the correct size. The squares should be 2.5 inches and the rectangles 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Now I'll sew 2 groups of 2 together in the center of the block. Press the seam towards the darker color. Now we're going to sew rows together. So the top 3 pieces, the center 4 pieces, and the bottom 3 pieces. So now I'm going to press the rows. I'm going to press the top and bottom rows towards the center and the middle row towards the outside. And the direction I'm pressing has to do with the amount of layers and what's going to press most easily, but I want them alternating so that when I go to sew these together, it makes it easier to nest them and get a nice corner. And this center row can go either direction. The next step will be to sew the 3 rows together to complete the block. So the square is finished. We just need to press the rows that we sewed. And I'm going to be pressing these outward. And there's the completed 8-point star variation. This quilt block is called Duck Tracks. I'm using 4 different colors for this particular block. I have 3 strips in a light, a medium light, and a medium dark. These are each 2.5 inches wide. And then I have another light strip, also 2.5 inches wide, and a dark strip that is 2 1/8 inches wide. And I'm going to be using my square ruler, although any size quilting ruler will work for the straight cuts. And I have this triangle ruler that's very handy. Now, if you don't have a triangle ruler, on my website, sewsparkstudio.com, you can find this template. Now, this template's designed for 8-inch squares. And if you've printed it correctly, this will be a 1-inch square, and these will be the right size triangles for an 8-inch block. I'm using 8-inch blocks for a quilt I'm making. I'm actually going to be cutting for 4 blocks, not just for 1, but I will let you know how many cuts you would need if you were only going to do the 1 block for this quilt block. So I'm starting with these 3, and I'm gonna do a little bit of speed cutting here. So I've got them all lined up, and I need some squares out of these ones. So I actually need 4 of the light squares and 2 of each of the medium light and medium dark, as I call them. And these are 2.5 inch squares. So I'm going to cut all of them at the same time. So this would give me the ones that I need for this and half of what I need for that. But as I said, I'm doing 4 blocks, so I can do another full cut here. And then I'll take these away and just finish my cuts in this one. I'm taking the leftover pieces from the medium light and medium dark, and I'm going to trim these to 2 1/8 inches wide. Now you could cut additional strips, but then I'd have more pieces that I'm not using, so I just decided to trim these out. And then I'm going to put these on top of each other as they were. I want this one here, it's a little shorter than the other one. I need 4 triangles. So each cut is going to give me 2 triangles of each color. And this width, I can use my ruler. And this ruler is squared off at the top. So your triangle, if you use the template, is going to stick out a little bit at the top. And these will be enough triangles for 1 quilt block. And I'm doing 4 of them. And there's not enough here to give me the total number I need. So I'm going to wait and see what scraps are left from other pieces I'm cutting. And then I will cut. I need 1 more of the medium dark and 1 more of the medium light. This is the dark fabric, and again I need the smaller triangles. I need 4 of them for each block, so I'm going to need a total of 16. And I'm getting 2 with each cut that I'm doing here. And again, I'm going to get 15 out of this. And I'll use a scrap to cut my 1 more triangle that's missing. And this is the 2.5 inch light fabric, and I'm cutting the larger triangle out of this. Again, I need a total of 16 triangles. So this one I'm getting 13 triangles, so I'm either going to need to cut another strip, or again, if I have some scrap left from other pieces I'm cutting, because I'm going to need 3 more for my last block. To start the duck tracks, I'm going to sew 2 of the squares together in the center, and then I'm going to sew one of the small triangles to the large triangle on each side, and then I'll do some pressing before I continue sewing. Take the squares from the center, a medium dark and a medium light, and stitch those together with a 1/4 inch seam. So when you're sewing the small triangle to the larger triangle, I like to fold it in half, each of these edges, to match them up, or center them rather. And so I just put a pin in there, or you could mark it with a pen, whichever you prefer. When you fold the larger triangle, if you've got this squared off corner on it, you want to imagine that as being pointed when you do this folding. And then just center those. And I'm starting by sewing the medium light or the medium dark piece to each of these. And then you can pin that or just hold it together. It's not a very long seam. It may seem like the smaller triangle's a little on the large side. I did that deliberately because I find if you're not 100% accurate, if you do the exact measurements for these, sometimes they come out a little off. So I like to do them a little bit on the large side, and then I'll trim them to the size that I need when they're done. I'm going to press towards the darker fabric. What you want with these is when you sew them together, they're going to be like this. You want one to be pressed down and the other one to be pressed up, so that when you sew these together, they nest where those seams meet here, and it makes it easier to get a nice square matching corner there. So as I said, I press towards the dark on both of them, which means that these are going to be the right direction for stitching them together. And then the triangle pieces as well need to be pressed, and you're going to press these towards the smaller triangle, the darker color in this case. This is the duck tracks block so far. I'm going to do 2 things in the next step. I'm going to sew these 2 together so that they are a square in the center, and I'm going to take the dark triangle and stitch on the opposite side of the larger triangle, the light triangle, on each set around the edges. So I'm starting by stitching the 2 sets of squares together. I've got my seams lined up in the center. And if you did a good job of cutting and pressing, you should have a nice matching point at the center of that square. And then the triangles, again, matching up center points on these. So this piece in the center, the square, can be pressed either direction. It really doesn't matter. Triangle sections, again, press towards the darker, the small triangle. And when these are trimmed, they will be rectangles. Each of these rectangles needs to measure 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So I start by just squaring off the bottom of the triangle and just mostly clipping the corners on this. And then I measure 2.5 inches and trim the other side. And then I line up 2.5 inch line at the bottom and 2 1/4 inch at the peak of the triangle, and trim off the one side and flip it, line up 4.5 inches, squared off with the ruler, and trim the other side. Now we'll sew the rows together. So the top row, the middle row, and the bottom row. I'm going to press the top and bottom rows towards the outside and the center row towards the middle, so that the pressing alternates and makes it easier to nest the corners and get nice sharp corners. And the next step will be to sew the 3 rows together to complete the block. So now we're going to press the rows we just sewed. And I'm going to press these in towards the center. And there's our completed Duck Tracks block. This block is called the Dutchman's Puzzle, and I'm using 3 colors for it, a light, a medium, and a dark. To start cutting, I'm going to start with the light fabric. You are going to be cutting smaller triangles with this, and I have a triangle ruler that I'm using, but if you don't have one of those, on my website, sewsparkstudio.com, I have this template. Now this template is for an 8-inch quilt block, so if you want a different size, I'm sure if you search you'll find lots of templates for lots of different sizes of this block, but this one is available on my site. Just make sure that you print it out at 100% so that this square is a 1-inch square, and that will make sure these triangles are accurate. Now my triangle here has a little flat edge at the top, and so you'll notice that if you use these templates, they're going to extend a little bit past the edge of the fabric, or you can trim it off so that line it up on the bottom and then just trim off the top, because that piece gets trimmed later anyway. To start out with, I'm cutting the light fabric, and you're going to need 16 triangles that are this size out of the light. And so this strip might not be quite long enough, and I may have to use some scraps to get the whole 16. So, and each time I cut, I'm getting 2 of them. So I'm going to get 15 out of this, so I need one more, and I have some scraps from other things I've been cutting that I'll cut that additional piece out of. These are the 2.5 inch strips of the medium and the dark. I'm going to put them on top of each other. And I need a total of 4 triangles of each color of the larger size. So each cut gives me 2 of each color, so I just need to do 2 cuts. For the Dutchman's puzzle, I'm going to start by sewing one of the smaller triangles to one side of each of the larger triangles. To begin, I like to take each edge of the triangle that I'm going to sew and fold it in half to find the center. And when you do it where there's this cut edge, you want to extend it. Imagine that it's pointed there. And then I match those center points. And you can pin it or hold it. You could also mark it with a pen if you preferred. And so it's going to seem like the smaller triangle is on the large size compared to the edge of the larger one. And I deliberately cut it a little bit big because if there's any inaccuracies in sewing, if there's no margin for error, your block might not be the correct size. So I cut it a little bit large and then I trim it to the size that I want when I'm done. So each of these triangle pieces that I sewed is pressed, and you are going to press, in this case, towards the lighter fabric. Normally I press towards the darker one, but on this type of block, this rectangular block, I press out towards the smaller triangle. This is the Dutchman's puzzle so far. The next step is to take the small triangle that is going to be sewn to the opposite side of the larger triangle. Now sewing the light triangle to the darker one on the opposite side, again centering the edge before stitching. More pressing, so press it as it was sewn, and then in this one we're pressing towards the lighter triangle, so out from the larger triangle. And when this is trimmed, it will be a rectangle. So each of these rectangles is going to end up being 4.5 by 2.5 inches. So I'm trimming the bottom of the large triangle first on a straight line, and then measuring 2.5 inches from that. And then I line up the 2 1/4 line with the peak of the triangle and make sure that it's squared across the bottom here. And then I'm trimming the one side and then lining up at 4.5 inches and trimming the other side. So there's my rectangle in the correct size. I'm going to sew sets of 2 together, so I will end up with 4 squares for this block. Press the seam towards the lighter colored triangle. Now we're going to sew rows. We're going to sew the top 2 pieces together here and the bottom 2 pieces together here. So now I'm going to press these in opposite directions so that it'll be easier to sew it together and get a nice corner in the middle. And you can see this one already has a preference for the direction that it wants to go. And the final step will be to sew the seam in the middle and complete the block. I'm going to press the row that we just finished. And doesn't really matter which way you press this one. And there's our completed DUTCHMAN'S puzzle block.